Hello and welcome. In this video, I will be doing a fight breakdown of the formal debate between Sargon of Akkad and Christy Winters. I look to, in this video, show where each of the participants scored legitimate points, where they went well off topic, where they failed to connect their argument to the central topic, and to offer an analysis of the points actually given. This is to help individuals out there who have the lust of the intellectual rigor of debate, who want to have greater finesse in the arena to take on opponents that may seem to have an advantage. Take, for example, this very debate where we have a PhD versus a guy with a YouTube channel. So how does this debate work? First, you'll have opening statements, and this is pretty standard for a formal debate. Each side will be given a set amount of time to discuss their arguments relative to the topic at hand. They will lay out some crucial evidence which supports why they are a proponent or opponent of the proposition. Once opening statements are done by each participant, we then move to the cross-examination. This follows the simple A-B format in this case. The first person to speak will be the first person to cross-examine, and the first person to offer a close. Each of these segments will provide a different avenue for providing evidence towards your position. An opening statement should be focused on laying out the very basic information that you will be using to justify your position. You are framing your argument in the opening statement. Ideally, in this time, you will also massage the topic's agenda some. Is feminism good for the world? That is an extremely broad topic. It'll be difficult to actually boil that down to any type of focus or actual trajectory to manage. So by massaging the topic slightly to bring it around to how your evidence can better suit it is going to be vital at this point. Adhering perfectly to a topic that is so broad is extremely difficult. If you're opening first, you have an advantage in laying out your argument without having to address your opponent. You can actually go straight ahead with all of your facts to lay out the best possible position for best possible argument for your position. When you open second, you now have an additional burden placed upon you. Not only do you have to lay out your argument in totality, offering as much evidence as you can for why you hold this position, but also to address some of the points that were already placed by your opponent. Now, it seems strange to be using that opening segment for this, but let me elaborate some, because the cross-examination period usually is where you want to start attacking your opponent. But we want to see doubt in the audience as quickly as possible. So in your opening, allowing for time to address the anticipated arguments of your opponent, you can fold that into your logic, your argument, to begin to shake up your opponent, to begin to erode some of the evidence as the rest of the audience will see. I think a great example from this particular debate here, as we will go over, will be the 1 in 5 statistic. We hear about rape culture, so you bring up the 1 in 5 statistic, and then you talk about how this is used to justify rape culture. If you can bring into the audience's mind that bad research led to this number, and by having this number then touted as part of rape culture, you can show that this is actually on this claim of being rape culture is on extremely shaky ground. An opponent or a proponent of his feminism will say that yes, we have a rape culture and we need to address this to better protect women and men out there. Whereas if you are an opponent, you can say, well, hold on, there's not really a rape culture because it's only there because of bad statistics, right? And if that's in your opening, you've already eroded one central element of your other participants' argument. So as you approach a debate like this, you should start by gathering all of the evidence you can. That is point one. Once you have all of your evidence, analyze it, go through it. Not only should you be building a coherent, logical, flowing argument from the evidence which you have compiled, you should also be gleaning out of it anticipated objections to the evidence that you have. This is often done very clearly in the actual scientific writing itself, where it'll say possible limitations or objections, something in the conclusion of these papers that will give some insight to you as to how individuals may counter the claims made in that paper. That, broadly speaking, will be the arguments from your opponent on that topic. Once you have the body written, just like you would with an essay, start with the body. Write your closing. Your closing should be succinct. It should be able to roll in all of the points that you will be making throughout the entirety of the debate. Not only should you be moving away from the massaged topic, you should be moving that towards the broad topic, saying that, well, you know, Western feminism is not helping the world anymore. It is really failing women and men on many levels. So the topic isn't, is Western feminism helping people today? It's, is feminism good for the world? But by beginning with that massage topic, you can then use the evidence towards why it's bad in general, as an example. Once your closing has been written, including offering additional time to address some of the points that are anticipated, both anticipated and made in the debate, write your opening statement. Within the opening statement, you should be very clear as to how much contempt you hold for the point or praise you have for the point, depending on which side of it you are on. By doing that, you can get the emotional side of the audience invested. I have said this time and again when it comes to debates that your aim in a debate is not to convince your opponent. Your opponent is arguing with a plethora of evidence for their position. They are well entrenched and grounded in that position. To uplift them, or uproot them, I should say, from that position is very difficult, if not impossible. And in fact, it is difficult to the point that you should not consider it in your approach to this topic. Instead, I would strongly encourage people to focus more on seeding doubt in the audience. Be ready to erode the central core arguments that are made by your opponent. By doing so, individuals listening into the debate will scratch their heads and say, maybe feminism isn't good for the world, or maybe feminism is good for the world. We're not going full merchants of doubt here where we just are going to throw around spurious, loosely linked bits of evidence in order to just slightly rock the boat enough that you have a few easily gullible people buying into your side. Instead, I want this to be as such where you have someone like Winters, who, PhD in feminism effectively, will not move, but some of the acolytes underneath who are still developing and finding themselves within this intellectual framework will say, wait a second, that's a good point. Why don't my gender studies professors talk about X? That's where we're trying to go with this. So, broadly speaking, we are asking today, is feminism good for the world? That is about as broad of a topic as you could possibly propose for a debate between a feminist and an anti-feminist. The only other question broader than that would be, is feminism good? Now, without waiting much longer, as I've now laid out effectively how a debate works, how to prepare for it, let's get into the meat of it. The debate, you can see we're starting about 4 1/4 minutes in. We're just clearing off a train going by and how the debate is going to be structured, plus introductions. Ms. Winters and Sargon of Akkad agreed for Ms. Winters to go first, and that's where we will begin.
First, I'd like to thank the Skeptic Feminist for hosting, Carl for joining, and also the audience for taking the time out of your day to watch this. Is feminism good for the world? Before I start, I think it's important to first ask the question, why do we need feminism?
Now, pausing it here. One of the things I mentioned right off the start in how you want to approach debate, especially broad topic debate like this, is to massage the topic down to something more appropriate. Here, Ms. Winters has already started by saying, why do we need feminism? This isn't exactly that massaging, but we've now immediately shifted away from the central topic and we're talking about something that she finds important. This is a way for her to stage her evidence and allowing her to then link that evidence back to the central point.
And to answer that, I'd like to paraphrase a YouTuber who summed it up better than I think I've ever heard it done. And that was by Captain Andy, who's referenced number 1 below. And that is that when we compare the lives of men and women, they are so different that that difference is worth talking about.
That difference is worth talking about. So here's a piece of evidence that Ms. Winters has brought up from an individual who just has a YouTube channel. There's nothing special about Captain Andy. He's just a guy with an interest in the topic. In essence, he's a feminist Sargon of Akkad, although far less talented, in my opinion. So those differences are worth talking about. Absolutely, differences are worth talking about. Today's weather is sunny and partly cloudy, and yesterday's weather was stormy and rainy. Is there any value on talking about that difference? Some would say yes. If you're a meteorological scientist, you'd say yes. If you're someone who follows an almanac, you'd say yes. But does that value actually give a judgment of the quality of that discrepancy? In essence, it doesn't, because opinions will be abound about people who love storms over sunny days, people who prefer hot, dry days in order to help their sun-loving plants grow as compared to people who want those wet days to water their fields. There's no value you can absolutely ascertain from that difference. Keep note of that as we continue on.
In Western nations, people encouraged by feminist women and men have been talking about these differences and the discrepancies between and within the sexes for a few centuries now, if we date it back to Mary Astle's 1694 A Serious Proposal to the Ladies.
So, we've been talking about these differences. That's wonderful. What does that mean, though? We're not told if those differences actually mean anything. That is being avoided at this point. In fact, not only is it being avoided directly, there's an insinuation from the feminist position that those differences are inherently bad, and that those differences should be erased in whatever way possible. That there's no unique value to being a man as compared to being a woman, or vice versa.
Which argued that women should receive an education that includes more than preparing them to be wives to their husbands, but to develop their own intellects and abilities.
First point she's making. Mary Astle is for the first wave of feminism. In other words, the educational equality to be brought about for women. Just a point to keep note of as we continue on.
Reference 2. Proceeding from this view that the difference between men and women's lives are worthy of our consideration, evaluation, and discussion, that brings us on to what to do when we see inequalities, inequities, discrimination, or marginalizations, and that is to do reform.
To engage in reform because we see inequalities, inequities, differences, in other words. That is a noble goal. In fact, in a philosophical sense, that is what most people aim to do when they see something that can be otherwise judged as unfair to a particular group. The question at hand, of course, is feminism good for the world? So how does feminism actually relate to this point? How is feminism, as an ideology which begets a methodology, able to tackle the inequalities which we see?
I use as my definition of feminism today the following: a range of political movements, ideologies, and social movements that share a common goal: to define, establish, and achieve equal political, economic, personal, and social rights for women.
Equal social, equal personal rights. If you have social rights, you have personal rights. If you want to establish equality on the personal level, you effectively want to erase all form of identities out there and have everyone as a single weird mess of human emotions that are somehow consistent across the board. Just as an opinion on this very point, ridiculous proposition to ever want personal equality. Social equality, yes. Economic, absolutely. But personal, that is a very curious thing to argue for.
Women. That's taken from Wiki, but it's based on reference 3. I will focus initially on the specific ways that feminist principles inspired women and men to improve women's lives. These are the direct...
Women and men. Women and men. Women, pause, and men.
effects of feminism. Near the end, I will review what I call the indirect or knock-on effects by enumerating a few of the ways men have benefited from feminism as a set of values.
So at the end of how feminists have helped women throughout the ages, she's then afterward going to talk about how men have also benefited, after women have benefited.
And from feminist activism. In answering yes to the question, is feminism good for the world, I will address the common objection framed as yes, but. To do so, I'm going to borrow shamelessly from the comedian Louis C.K., who talks about categories of things he calls, of course, but maybe, to describe his ambivalent comportment to certain social phenomena. It goes like this. Of course the world needed first-wave feminism.
So, in this setup here, I'm trying to rely upon some pop culture reference. We have Ms. Winters beginning to lay out why she thinks feminism is good for the world. So we began with a different question, which she then answered, and then went on to support, and then has moved along like, hey, there's differences. In essence, she says, there's differences in the world between men and women. Feminism talks about those differences. And because feminists talk about those differences, we've moved ourselves towards erasing inequalities. It's those differences talked about by feminism which have resulted in less inequality in this world. It is feminism to thank for that. That essentially is her argument so far. It's consistent, it's logical, it has great integrity to it, and there's very little that one can do at this very juncture to begin to erode it. There's lots, but at this very moment there's little.
Generally seen as focusing on women's disadvantages in civil and political equality. Note 4. Girls and women should be educated and have access to higher education. And the 19th century Europeans who derided the idea of women's education were as wrong and bigoted as the Taliban and other fundamentalists who preach against educating girls.
Okay. No, they are not nearly as bigoted as Western Europeans were nowhere near as bigoted as the Taliban are. Women had a variety of very special protections within Western society at that time. Because they didn't have the right to vote doesn't mean that the rest of the men in society, somehow the poor beggars on the street or the useless fodder for wars, somehow held the highest power in the land to determine that women don't deserve these rights is an absurd position. This is not at all consistent with laws at the time, how those laws came around to be constructed. Again, the Taliban in this case here using Islamic law, a law that is derived from the Hadiths in Sharia, effectively undermines all autonomy, all agency that women have. It is a disgusting practice that should not be compared to in essence, a social failing of the Western Europeans.
Malala's campaign being the most famous example of the fight to educate girls are today. That's note 5.
Malala Yousafzai is not the great of a hero as I think people want to hold her up to be. Only in regard to female education is she a hero. When it comes to the erasure of the bigotry, inherent bigotry within Islam, she is an apologist and as complicit in its continuation as someone like al-Awlaki or al-Baghdadi today.
Of course, women should be equal citizens in law, and feminist women and their male allies who work to reform voting laws, laws that denied women the right to their own earnings, inheritance laws, and reform of 19th century divorce laws were right. Today, we should support women who are legally second-class citizens in their own nations around the world, so they can
around the world. We should support these women around the world. Feminism should support women around the world. Okay, feminism will support women around the world. Keep note of that. This is feminism that looks to erase some particular social inequality in regards to access to education, voting rights, marital law, rights to earnings into the workplace, and so forth. It should care about that in other countries.
Experience the benefits of first wave feminism brought primarily to white women standing more so than other women in the West. Of course, the world needed second wave feminism, which sought to reform the sexual and family rights of women. Feminists in the U.S. were right to point out that the personal was political while campaigning.
The personal is never political. I want to be clear on this point. It is a absurd phrase. When you allow the personal to be political, you create modern feminism. You allow the inconveniences, the annoyances, and the perceived barriers to become giant systemic or systematic monsters specifically designed to oppress not just women, but you personally because of your characteristics somehow that you were born with being the only way to identify you. The personal is not political. And honestly, I think feminism probably started going off the rails at that point.
For, among other things, criminalizing marital rape in the 1970s to the 1990s, because no legislative body dominated by men until that point had raised awareness or had dealt with the issue of marital rape, and to raise awareness of and encourage the prosecution of domestic violence.
Now, what do we know about domestic violence today? We know that today domestic violence is about equal in perpetration by men and women within relationships. I'm not saying that each relationship is equally likely to produce it. I'm not saying anything of the sort. I'm saying that in instances where we have reported domestic violence, we have an equal report rate that women are the aggressor and that men are the aggressor. It takes different forms. Men will use their fists, their hands, their body. Women will use objects. It is a bad situation where domestic violence is involved, but let's be clear here. It is an equal problem between the genders in the perpetuation of it. Yet feminism focused on how it hurt women and how we need to prosecute men. Look at the Duluth model. The Duluth model says that as a man you are inherently at fault. If a woman beats you, abuses you, torments you for years, and one day in one of another of her many fits of rage, as she is battering a man, that man pushes her off of him to leave the house, to flee, that man, under the Duluth model, becomes the aggressor and the perpetuator of that domestic violence through the entirety of the relationship, that he is solely at fault for that domestic violence. That is the system that feminism begets. That is what you get with feminist ideology and its methodology telling us how domestic violence works. So, well, Ms. Winters here can be completely fine in saying how feminism brought about our focus on the pain caused by domestic violence in relationships. It is not focused on the gender being irrelevant. It's focused on how women were affected by it more.
Notes 7 and 8. Shining a light on all forms of violence in the home are desperately needed around the world today, and
around the world today. Well, there we go to the world again.
Especially in nations hostile to feminist movements, where women are not provided with the resources needed.
Nations hostile to feminist movements. You'll notice here, sorry, side point, that I will repeat something that one of the participants will say, and then I will elaborate on it. I want this just for clarity's sake. Hostile to feminist movements. This is one of those equations between women are feminists and feminists are women. There are movements out there which nations are equally hostile to because it has to do with their traditions around how women are viewed in their society. Feminism will be rebuked just as any other of it. But in this particular instance, it's being rebuked because feminism is women. The proposal are coming from women, so therefore, because these nations hate women, they rebuke it. No, even if it comes from liberal-minded men, it is rebuked. Look at places like Bangladesh and Indonesia, where attempts to have social change done result in liberal-minded men being hacked to death. These men aren't gay in many instances. They are, in fact, still Muslim men. They're just Muslim men with a progressive ideal that report upon it, that write about it, and end up being slaughtered as a result. Just an example of how this trick of feminists being women and women being feminists rears its head when it's being talked about by a feminist.
To escape violence. Of course, women should have access to contraception. We all know the ability to control the timing and number of pregnancies is vital to a woman's educational success and her ability to provide for her family.
Many people brought up the point that feminists did not develop contraceptives. No, contraceptives were developed by science and by effectively a farmer who knew a little trick about how to manage his horses. But contraceptives and feminism do have a happy overlap, and one that I think people would waste their breath in trying to argue. It's a minutiae point that actually offers no additional value to this particular debate. To me, it seems absurd to spend the time actually going over how contraceptives were developed and how it was done by men and how these men who were not feminists were looking to benefit from this very point. At this juncture, it's not worth arguing about. However, we will come across a moment here in not too long where that will change.
Note 9. Feminists are doing great work around the world, helping women obtain access to contraception. Note 10.
Feminists are doing work around the world that are allowing women to get access to contraception. That smug look on her face comes from the thought, or comes from the fact that it is feminists who are piggybacking on larger egalitarian movements that are bringing these social changes about to these countries. Médecins Sans Frontières, they believe in contraceptives. They are not a feminist organization, but they have feminists within it who then provide the contraceptives. Does that mean feminism is responsible for that? Absolutely not. In essence, this comes down to Hitchens' razor. Name a good deed carried out by a religious person that could not be performed by a non-religious person. In this instance here, we could say name a good deed performed by a non-feminist that could not also be performed by a feminist under the rubric of, is this feminism? I don't think that it is a fair move, and it is not, and it should have been called out by Ms. Winters, to equate actions done by feminists to be actions done by feminism, especially when the organizations providing the mobilization for such efforts are not feminist organizations.
Access to contraception and abortion are necessary for women's bodily autonomy. Of course, of course, of course. But maybe, the Louis C. paradigm goes, but maybe feminism has run its course in the US and the UK and other Western nations.
Social issues. Voting? Check. Education? Check. Earnings? Check. Private ownership? Check. Contraceptives and sexual autonomy? Check. Workplace rights for women? Check. So, as feminism has brought about, apparently feminism, and only feminism, has brought about equality between men and women in our nation, why do we still need it in the West? What else is left? If you've listed all the possible facets of our social life, making all facets of our social life becoming equal, why then do we still need feminism? In fact, this goes to the very original question Christy Winters asked. Why do we need feminism? We don't if it's already achieved all of its particular goals. More on that in a bit.
Maybe self-identified feminist women and men should stop focusing on their own communities, stop focusing on their fellow citizens and their own countries, and instead devote all their time and efforts to feminist activism in non-Western countries.
That's a fantastic proposal. Maybe we actually should act upon that. Because it would seem to me that is at the point we are at. Feminism began its downfall some time ago when we decided the personal was political. If we want to move ahead and make those changes to the world, our global community, we need to focus on the dark corners and bringing light to them. Of course, these dark corners are not very small, and in fact envelop more of the world than liberal democracy does. Even in places like, say, Brazil and Argentina, places like South Africa, Portugal even, they have issues around women's rights and access to contraceptives because of an overarching ideology called Catholicism. How do you tackle these points as a feminist using feminist methodology to take on the Catholic Church? To say what your treatment of women, or the treatment of women in your country is abhorrent and we need to address it. Not once will Ms. Winters lay out a framework for which feminism actually acts on these points. She just says, oh, well, we do it. Is that not enough? I mean, I talk about politics all the time. I don't vote, but I talk about politics all the time, and that's just the same.
Before I continue, I would like to conclude that bit by saying that I think most people would agree that feminism and feminist activities have been a force for good in the world. I would go further by saying that most people would probably agree that women outside of Western democracies would be far better off, better protected under feminist-inspired laws that would end the barbaric practices of female genital mutilation, Note 11, of child brides, Note 12, acid violence against women, excuse me, Note 13, and honor killings, Note 14.
The operative word here is have or has. Feminism has been good for the world. Has. Past tense. All the topics listed there are worth discussing, but they are worth discussing not under a feminist rubric because it does not have the teeth or the mobility to actually make legitimate change on any of those points. And in fact, if you were to put effort in under the feminist rubric to address those points, you would very rapidly be exhausted of your resources because of the shallowness that exists within feminism. If you are going to be a feminist in the West, focusing on feminist issues of the West, you will talk about how the AC is too cold, how men take up too much space on a subway seat, or how men who accidentally bump into you are actually doing so because they have no respect for women. It seems very strange to me that if you were to be honestly concerned as a feminist to bring about the equality between the sexes, your emphasis should be on areas where it does not exist to the same degree. This is not an argument of the blind spot, however. This is one that says simply that by proportionality, you will cultivate greater rewards, greater progress dealing with larger issues than with minor ones.
All know that feminism, as I have defined it, is the remedy to these gendered human rights violations.
At no point will she actually make that argument. Feminism is a remedy to honor killings, to acid attacks, to ongoing subjugation of women, to sexual slavery, to female trafficking. All of those points will not receive correction from feminism. Not only will it not in a political or practical sense, it will not under Christy Winters' own definition and own points that she makes. In fact, she makes this statement and then entirely abandons it for the rest of it. And if to the point of an individual who will be engaging in a debate with someone like Winters on such a topic, you should be looking for statements made that have some type of weight to them that actually would significantly harm your own argument, but then are abandoned immediately after. This topic changing is indicative of someone who lacks evidence and who does not have intellectual rigor on their side pushing ahead. She abandons this point. We know she does. Pay attention to it.
In the West, however, and to borrow from Fukuyama, are we at the end of feminism in the 21st century?
Yes, we are. Thank frickin' spaghetti god.
That premise would be that the equality between the sexes has been achieved, and feminism has nothing left to do. Personally, I would love to see that realized.
Then open your eyes, Miss Winters. For someone with a PhD and a fantastic ability to read, you still have yet at a single point shown at any type of level laws which exist that give men more rights than women. In fact, the application of the laws may be at play here, which is unfortunate. But the laws still do exist to ensure the protection of equal rights between men and women. I will go over an objection to this in my closing statement to this whole debate, but you can see the smugness about how I wish it were the case. Well, who makes money off of pointing out where there aren't equalities? I don't. In fact, I wish I could spend my time talking about consciousness and how consciousness operates within artificial intelligence. I wish I could be spending my time talking about hockey. But this here, what we are seeing here, is a significant and profound social question of our day. And so now I have to spend my time dealing with individuals like Ms. Winters who are going to make this stupid claim that we do not have equal rights, equality within the West. Maybe we do have it between men and women, but what about this subset of a minority? What about this subset of a subset of a subset? What about this one person, the only person in existence with this particular set, this particular matrix of modular factors? Why do they not have explicitly written out rights? Why is it that the Constitution doesn't mention that men named John get free speech? That must mean men named John don't actually have free speech in this country. That is in essence what we're hearing.
I would love to see a society where women and men experience life.
Oh, hold on. She said men first there, but had to correct herself because men actually can't go first. So she had to go back and say women and men. If that's not a sign of the mind of a female supremacist, I'm going to have a hard time identifying other psychological factors which would indicate that.
With equal fairness in the workplace, in the legal system, and in their private lives.
You have it. You have it, and you have it. And in fact, if you don't believe you have it, then tell me why women are still allowed to have so much alone time, allowed to spend their own money, allowed to work at the companies for which they choose to work at, have sexual partners which they choose to have, and at the end of the day are guaranteed a base level of safety in this society. Why are those factors still allowed if women don't have those ensured equal rights?
However, I don't see evidence to support this.
She doesn't see evidence to support that women have those rights. Well, it's like talking to a Christian who says, I don't see how this universe could exist without God. Well, here's an explanation for it. Well, I just still don't see it. So therefore, I'm going to believe what I want to believe.
There is still far more work that needs to be done by feminists in the world, including in the West. Yes, many of the legal victories sought by first-wave feminists have been achieved in Western nations. But there is still much to do when we come to the problems raised in the last century by second-wave feminists.
This comes back to that very point of name one law where men as a group are given rights or where women as a group are denied rights. It is unfathomable an individual who so willfully engages in this ignorance to the point where you could only define it as stupidity. Actually, in Sargon's own paradigm, do not assume malice where stupidity is a better explanation. I don't think stupidity is something that Christy Winters is in large supply of, in fact. So I am left to believe that it is actually the former within that paradigm and not the latter.
Imagine the following scenario. You go out.
Okay, here she's going to talk about a rape case. I mentioned this originally in the video prior to this. In essence, a woman gets drunk. She goes with her friend back to his place. She passes out, wakes up, realizes that a man had used her mouth for his own pleasure, had ejaculated in her mouth on her face. When this man was tried by a criminal court, he was acquitted on the charges. The prosecutor appealed to the Criminal Appeals Court in Oklahoma and said, look, this is a crime. And the appeals court, in essence, said, you tried this man under this law, Law A. Under Law A and its definitions in its totality, the law which you are charging this man under does not enumerate this particular act as being unlawful. Therefore, if you were going to charge him with this law, he's going to be acquitted, as he was in this case. What is not mentioned by Ms. Winters here, and was gone over in great detail by the Justicar, please go watch this video if you haven't, is that the law which prevents this activity, making this activity unlawful, already exists. And it was the prosecutor's personal failing, the male prosecutor's personal failing, to apply the correct law and charge this delinquent, this disgusting human being, with the correct law to ensure his imprisonment. He failed to do that. The prosecutor failed to do that. So the man is going to be acquitted. Like just the Justicar joked about, you might as well have tried this guy for a carjacking, saying he carjacked this woman. Well, did a carjacking take place? No. Well, then he didn't carjack her. He's acquitted. He broke the law, but he was charged with the wrong law. So therefore, gone. Blind skipping here.
And this is a direct result of those feminist ideals that have inspired feminists to right wrongs. Note.
So, feminists ended up changing rape laws, is what she is said in previous examples, marital rape laws. So, the rape laws which were changed did not include men originally. Did not include men. So feminists acted, they saw there was a discrepancy here, that women are actually allowed to be raped within their relationships, and feminists said, this isn't appropriate, we must change these laws, and they got together and they organized and they lobbied and they litigated and they were successful in making those changes. All right, it's now illegal for a man to rape his wife. Fantastic. And then one little voice in the back room goes, well, is it okay for a wife to rape her husband? And everyone laughed at that point. Feminism.
16. Until now, I have focused on the direct benefits that feminist activists work to achieve for women and girls. But in these last few minutes, I'd like to point out how feminism has had knock-on effects that benefit boys and men. There is a clear pattern in U.S. social movement history of feminists raising an issue that disproportionately impacts women. And that discussion then creates a space for men to talk about their experiences with that phenomenon.
So feminism, by its acts, allows individuals from the female side to begin to talk about how these particular acts or events harm them. Not inherently wrong. Rape is an example of this. But in the process of that, women, feminists, once they have achieved the ends for women, then allow the space for men. They then allow men to now contribute again, and we will listen to the problems of men. If women within these feminist movements, who then get these benefits for women in society in general, really care about men, why was the lobbying effort originally not also including men?
An example is domestic abuse. Second wave feminists took the lead on challenging domestic abuse as
the Duluth model.
What people used to consider a private matter, and instead started to talk about it as a crime. This opened up a space for men who are victims of domestic abuse to discuss their experiences and how it uniquely impacts them. An example of intersectional feminism.
An example of my smug ideology. Isn't it so convenient that my ideology is the one true way to actually solve all the problems in this world? How wonderful, how lucky. Yeah, I've got a razor synapse. What are you going to do about it? It is remarkable that you will see, and I'm going to bring it up now as we are coming to the end of her points, that actually here, no, I'll hold on to that. We'll finish up a couple points from her and I'll bring it up.
Rape and rape culture are topics that feminists have been challenging for decades now.
Rape culture. Here, another point for you debaters out there. She has now dropped a word, a term. What was said at the beginning by the Skeptic Feminist, that anything that is brought about without evidence to support it will count as an argument from ignorance. An undefined term also falls under that. If you have a term that is supposed to describe not only a state of mind held by society, but a particular systematic structure and how that systematic structure operates within a societal context, affecting men and women differently, then you need to define the term properly. She does not define rape culture. I don't know how you can determine that we have a rape culture in the West. It makes no fucking sense to me, but here's Ms. Winters laying out that we do have a rape culture. But again, just like earlier, here is a vital point that she has brought up that will actually, if implemented correctly, be a crushing blow to the opponent in this debate, but drops it. A topic change.
Recall the efforts to criminalize marital rape. Opening up these discussions created a public space for men and teen boys who have been victimized.
We've now developed enough of the laws to protect women, which means it's okay to have spaces for men, because the women are already taken care of.
Talk about their experiences, and for experts to see the various male myths that prevent men from reporting sexual assaults. And a final example, although there are
feminists are the ones who are making it possible for men to report their sexual assault. Feminists are. It's the only ideology that is allowing that.
There are many I could have chosen. Kirsten Gillibrand, an outspoken feminist U.S. senator, shone a light on the number of rapes in the U.S. military, highlighting the stories of women who had served their nation and were let down by the soldiers who were supposed to have their backs after they had been raped by their fellow soldiers or superior officers. A survey of sexual assault and, note 18. A survey of sexual assaults and rape in the military found a large number of men reporting rape and sexual assault as well, note 19. These
survey showed women being affected by it. Oh, and also men.
Problems first raised because they disproportionately impact women.
Disproportionately impact women. Disproportionately impact women. For rape within the military, which we know happens, to disproportionately impact women, that means that women who enter the military are far more likely to become the victim of sexual assault than men. This is likely true. In fact, this is probably likely true to the point that this is a great opportunity for someone on the other side of the debate to begin to erode the basis for which this claim can be made. The term disproportionately affects women is bandied about by Winters and other feminists with regularity in regards to topics that are larger. If we want to talk about numbers, though, men who have been serving the military for the entirety of the male's existence, not individually, but men have always been the military kind, women just recently in the West being allowed to fight, have also suffered for centuries under military culture, which in instances would result in them being raped. Men for centuries being raped in the military. But it was not worth talking about. You're a man. You were quiet about it. You don't bring it up. You just is what it is, move on. But now that a woman's been injured, just recently, we now need to look at solving that problem for women. Oh, yeah, and the men.
Came wider discussions in society about the problem itself, and more victims come forward. Feminism encouraged the improvement of men's lives outside of these issues as well. Equal pay efforts means women bring home a fairer wage that helps families economically. The efforts in the U.S. for family leave, and in this election cycle, paid family leave.
And, okay, fairer wage gap myth, in other words, that feminists are the only ones who are trying to correct the wage gap, and as such, any time that the wage gap narrows is not because of other economic factors or ideologies, it is solely the product of feminist activism. One little side note here, I did come across a paper just recently, and I will do my best to find it and throw it in the description. If it's not there, sorry, I just was unsuccessful. But it did say that since women have been flocking into the workforce since the 1950, I believe, is when the survey looked at the data, average wages of workers have been dropping. So it's not that women get paid less, it's that employers are just paying less. So women entering the workforce has resulted in a correlative manner, resulted in individuals, period, getting paid less in the workforce. Where's that feminist activism to approach that answer? Of course, we know what they would say. That's just sexism being hidden up by paying men less in order to continue paying women less. It seems to me that that argument is probably poorly supported.
benefit men. On a more practical level, widespread access to contraception means men benefit from women controlling the timing and number of their pregnancies. So in closing, feminism is a range of political movements, ideologies, and social movements that share a common goal to define, establish, and achieve equal political, economic, and social rights for women. Feminists, both men and women, work to achieve those goals by improving women's and men's lives around the world, allowing us to conclude that feminism is a force for good in the world.
All right, let's go over some of what was actually said by Ms. Winters here in her opening. Feminism is good for the world because we need feminism. In fact, feminism is the only way which we can approach the differences, the research differences between men and women. Feminism as an ideology has given us the methodology to investigate these ideologies or these differences and then put activism towards correcting them. Feminism actually gave us, so she argues, women's suffrage. Voting, earnings, education, and work accomplishments were provided for women in the first wave of feminism. The second wave of feminism brought around sexual and family rights for women, that sexual autonomy, the idea that women as persons actually are equal to men in that regard in operating in society. Feminism continued to work on a variety of levels to ensure that women, within the West at least, were provided with appropriate benefits and protections that men also had, while at the same time still benefiting from other cultural protections which may not have been enumerated within laws. Of course, this brings everything around to the point that we have other issues today within the West that need still further addressing. Pay inequality and rape culture are significant issues in the West that need feminism to look at and fix. Feminism as a tradition of success, so argued by Winters, is the methodology which we should be applying to these future issues, not only the ones that we can easily identify today in rape culture and the wage gap, but in fact issues that we will come across in the future as we develop our society into new directions. How will women and men operate as equal in their genders if we were to colonize another planet, to operate within a completely new concocted nation that is not of our own world? Those kind of questions, Ms. Winters believes, can be answered by feminism, but not only by feminism, only by feminism. In it, some of the supporting evidence that she has given was entirely around the success of first and second wave feminism. She offered no evidence, no methodology, no deep thought onto how third wave feminism, focusing on minor inequalities, is going to be able to tackle some of our significant social issues of the day. That leaves one to conclude that while feminism was good for a period of time, it has run its course. And in fact, because of the dearth of evidence provided by her, it's too difficult for us to determine exactly how well feminism will operate in the future. And what's frightening about this is one of the cases which she ought to have been able to do a very good job of laying out to us how structural sexism is hurting women and we need to have more comprehensive look at some of our laws. She actually bungles that up entirely, fails to do her due diligence in researching the case to ensure that individuals who will come across that case understand that it was not bad laws that allowed that to take place. It was a bad prosecutor. It wasn't a system of terrible, tyrannical, authoritarian men looking to keep women down. It was, in fact, the incompetence of one bumbling, underpaid, overworked prosecutor. That was Ms. Winters' opening statement. She is arguing in the affirmative, is feminism good for the world? Functionally speaking, she did all right. She touched on a few emotional topics that will drive people to want to support her. There's a certain galvanizing when we hear about oppression taking place. In our society, especially more of us liberal-minded ones, we really want equality to be the standard. We don't want to see people being treated unjustly or unfairly. So by tapping into the emotion of your audience, you can draw people closer towards the logic of your arguments. And if you fail to do that, you can use emotion to blind them from logic and have them adhere to your argument solely on the basis of their emotions. So, all in all, Ms. Winters has a very strong, well, I should say very strong, a strong opening. She lays out evidence, success of feminism, and says that it is an ideology and methodology which will be successful in the future because of its tradition of success. Her perceived tradition of success. Structurally, let's say that, yeah, evidence is there. Brought it all around, touched back on the central topic several times, showed how her support for it works, but not exactly how the function of it works.
Thank you very much, Christy. That is 10 seconds left to your time.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot to mention that part there. I had 8 seconds left, but nonetheless, she used almost the entirety of her 10 minutes of her opening.
Appreciate it. Now, Carl, would you please
which took about 45 minutes for me to go through.
Begin your opening statement.
Sure. And I'd like to start by thanking Christy for standing up for debate in an environment where the most prominent feminist theorists fail to adequately engage with dissenting viewpoints and close themselves away in academia.
This is a curious opening from Sargon here. It is a dig, a chirp, but it's not really relevant to the topic at hand yet. It could be a placeholder. It could just be a pylon which he will use later. But for now, it seems like a strange opening. And in fact, if you were to sit here in another debate which you may be entering into from a neutral position or an indifferent position, looking to be persuaded out of their way, this would be one way that you would be pushed away from supporting Sargon's position. It is a strange, in my mind, opener.
I genuinely wish to thank her for this dialogue. Feminism is a social science, and therefore naturally uses the social science method of asking people things to gather data. As you can imagine, this leads to data that is hard to measure twice. Note 1. When 270 scientists on 5 continents decided to try and replicate 100 cognitive and social psychology experiments, 75% of these social psychology experiments could not be replicated.
All right. So, social sciences have a validity and reliability issue. This has nothing to do with the topic at hand yet. It's not tied to it in any way. It wasn't set up in any way. It was just, we're going to go right for the meat. We're not going to have any pre-dinner talk. We're not going to have a glass of wine or even a sip of water. I am just picking up this steak with my hands and gnawing on its mostly raw flesh. And in fact, it seems like a very weird thing to do.
Even when the studies could be replicated, the results were consistently found to be exaggerated. I am sure that one contributory factor is the extremely high amount of political bias in American universities, note 2.
Okay, so social sciences have validity and reliability issues because of bias which exists in academia. All right, that might be a very sound argument so far. How does it relate to our topic? If you are listening in here, Sargon, I don't want to tear you apart. It's not my goal. I want to kind of be a little guidance, maybe a little coaching here. I've got lots of debate experience, so it gives me the opportunity to impart some of that wisdom. And while these points that you're making are relevant, smart, researched, they are not relevant to the point that they tie directly into your topic because it wasn't set up as such.
A 2014 study by the Higher Education Research Institute found that 59.8% of all undergraduate faculty nationwide identify as far left or liberal, compared with the only 12.8% as far right or conservative. This bias is even more pronounced in the social sciences. In a 2015 study, note 2 again I think, that found 58 to 66% of social scientists were left-wing and only 5 to 8% right-wing. And that means there are 8 Democrats for every Republican. For the same reason, for some reason, conservatives aren't signing up in droves to do gender studies. Now, this has many effects on the social sciences, the first being on the very language used to describe the subject.
Okay, so social sciences established to be biased. Okay, psychology, some of the humanities, Although I don't want to say psychology too broadly, because my experience with it was quite the opposite. In fact, I think it was extremely open and discussion driven. But hey, I went to school a lot longer ago than I think what people are experiencing today. Still, not tying into the central topic. Wonderful. You've identified that universities are biased. You've identified that the social science produced by universities are therefore not valid or reliable because the bias is so systemic that it metastasizes, there's the word, into how the research is even being conducted.
This is a quote from a Scientific American article. Duart et al. Found similar distorted language across social sciences, where, for instance, certain words are used to suggest pernicious motives when confronting contradictory evidence. Deny, legitimize, rationalize, justify, defend, trivialize, with conservatives as examples, as if liberals are always objective and rational.
I listened to this point about 10 times. And I understand the gist of it, that the language used by, I'm guessing, papers when referring to conservatives seem to consistently be, they have pernicious motives, that they have very emotional, not objective motives behind why they act. And I don't see how that's relevant to this discussion.
In one test item, for example, the endorsement of the efficacy of hard work was interpreted as an example of a rationalization of inequality. The inability to objectively interpret arguments is just the beginning of the problems that are caused by political bias. The data
caused by political bias. This is being caused by political bias. Our inability to read papers clearly is caused by political bias. Our inability to produce valid and reliable studies are caused by political bias, which manifests itself within universities. Okay, cool. Again, nothing to do with the topic at hand. Well, the argument structurally is internally consistent, and it makes sense, and it flows. It still fails to bring itself back to the central argument at hand. If it's not talking about the central argument at hand, it has to be setting something up. But right now, I'm sitting here scratching my head, as I was when I listened to this the first time through live, going, what is he talking about? What am I supposed to be getting from this? I have a sense of where it's going because I understand how Sargon thinks because I've seen all of the videos he's put up on his channel. But I haven't seen yet how this is going to tie in within this very particular context. Assume the audience that you are talking to, listeners, is coming in neutral to the debate point. And if you're going to go off on what appears to be a tangent, individuals that know nothing about you, how you operate, any of your biases or your preconceived arguments, you need to be sure to keep them focused on the central topic. Beat it into their heads that no, feminism is not good for the world. Here's an example. No, feminism is not good for the world. Here's some philosophical reasoning which shows that alternative methods work. No, feminism is not good for the world because of this list of reasons. If you go off on these 2-3 minute long tangents, you're not going to have the opportunity to keep the audience on your side focused and to the very point of the topic at hand.
Itself is highly suspicious. The following is from an article published in Science Journal. For some years now, data drawn from social networks has been used by both academic sociologists and brand marketers to help them understand human behavior. Many projects and proposals have been based on information sourced this way. One major problem stems from the dubious reliability of information engendered by the networks themselves.
Take a quick note here. Look at Ms. Winters. Very bottom right corner. For those of you who are listening podcast style, I'll describe it. Almost the entire time Sargon has been talking, she has been furiously scribbling down notes. When Sargon was listening to Ms. Winters, he could have been doing some typing, but for the most part he looked like he was sipping tea and scratching his head. That investment, that engagement, well, is not picked up on by most, is picked up on by some, and you need to present yourself in these debates as being engaged in some way, writing notes down, staying into it. Yes, I understand you're not in an auditorium where you can look out at the audience, you can look up at the moderator, look at the presenter, you are at your computer desk in your private room, but you need to be appearing to come across as being directly involved in this. You have to be making notes, you have to be furiously invested.
Ruths and Pfeiffer stress that members of a network are far from being truly representative of the general population.
For those of you who missed the first part of this because I was an idiot and not actually bringing it up, he's talking about social network studies now. So we've moved past social science and bias in academia, but to social network studies. More research methods. Cool, okay. How does this tie into the topic? Winters is going to have a difficult time here looking at this point, however, which Sargon will stay on for some time, and then just dismissing it because he drops it, or pointing out, look at how quickly he dropped it himself. How trustworthy is this piece of evidence which is brought up in such a fleeting manner? That's a positive that we're seeing from Sargon right now. But again, I cannot emphasize this enough. It does not, at the moment, directly and consistently tie back into the topic at hand, either the actual broad topic or a massaged point made by him.
The common use of networks on social media is more likely to produce distortions due to bias. Consistent liberals are the group most likely to unfriend or block someone on the basis of opposing political views.
So liberals know how to use a computer better. Or, wait, to block them based upon a difference of views. Fantastic. I don't see what this point is trying to bring about, because if you are making this point, you have to tie in that it is actually feminists who are liberal thinkers. And if feminists are lefties, and lefties do this, then feminists are also guilty of doing this. That chain of reasoning is not established. A point that Winters could quickly turn on and say, are all feminists leftists? Are all feminists deep liberals? If we're so willing to block everyone, if I fail to block someone, does that make me a conservative? You have to mock him for making such a loose point.
Leading to social networks that are deeply misrepresentative of the general population. If a liberal professor at a liberal college...
Social network data, by the way, when we look at it, is extremely difficult for political ideologies because it, in essence, just like with survey data, has an inherently low response rate. It's not representative because the sample that you are looking at is already such a skewed sample that it makes it far too difficult to glean any actual information from the greater surrounding of the community, whether we're talking about just the dorm for which you live in, the campus as a whole, the community which the campus is in, the state, or even the country. So it is wrought with the same problems. Fantastic. We're getting a brief overview of failings of research methodologies.
Passes around a survey on social networks trafficked only by liberals, your data is only representative of liberals. It is unreliable due to political bias. If you can't rely on it, you can't draw any conclusions from it. This applies...
Again, there's more research methodologies. Whoop-de-freaking-do. Sorry to say. We're still not tied into the point. And why do I have to keep bringing this up? Because if I don't, the listeners... the audience will not understand how this tangent is actually working in a counterproductive manner. It is floating information, not grounded in the debate. It seems like he sat down to do this debate, opened a Word file for his preparation, started reading, realized in the middle of it that this is actually a script for a video I want to do soon, but I'm in too deep now to actually change the course, and is just gone with it.
To other identities too. For example, Pinterest has a user base that is 80% women, source 2 again.
What fucking source 2 is this? What fucking source 2 is this? He keeps, oh, source 2, source 2. So let's go. Scientific American. Okay, we'll open that in a new tab. Scientific American article, is social science politically biased? Here we go. Is social science politically biased? By Michael Shermer. Okay, writer of Skeptic magazine. I'm not seeing any links in here. No links, no links, no links, no links, no links, no links. Originally public, left behind. Okay, cool. So, fantastic. He wrote in The Moral Arc, which was his most recent book, pretty much all of these points, where all of his data is. Just as a note, friends and listeners, comrades, if I could so say, if you're going to use a source that is an article, that has a variety of other sources in it, because I don't think Michael Shermer in this argument did all the relevant research which shows these points, that everything from Pinterest being 80% female to language being used to regularly contort how conservatives are viewed within an academic setting. You want to go deeper in ensuring you're getting the actual links to the actual study. This comes across as being terribly unprepared. A rush job, in other words. Read one article, copy-pasted a big chunk of it, and went from there. Again, it seems more like he opened the wrong file and started reading and realized too late. But that's just me.
And it certainly applies to the liberal college campuses with a focus on the social sciences, which are, of course, where many of feminism's surveys are carried out.
Our first reference to feminism from his first point where he was deriding those who cloister themselves away in academia. Nowhere in the last, 3-4 minutes has he mentioned what this has to do with feminism. Oh, by the way, this academic circle kind of does have feminists in it, is all he has said. The problem isn't with feminists at this point. The problem is with social sciences, to which feminists do operate in, but social sciences are the problem. How does that tie into the topic? It doesn't.
Take, for example, the 1 in 5 students have been sexually assaulted or raped myth. Christopher Krebs and Christine Lindquist, the senior research social scientists at RTI International in the Center for Justice, Safety and Resilience, wrote an article in Time magazine where they say, as the two of the researchers who conducted the campus sexual assault study from which the number was derived, we feel we need to set the record straight. Although we used the best methodology available to us at the time, there are caveats that make it inappropriate to use the 1 in 5 number in the way it's being used today, as a baseline or only statistic when discussing our country's problem with rape and sexual assault on campus. They specifically say that the survey is not representative and includes not only rape but any sexual act that could legally constitute a crime, and that it was web-based, shared around social media with a 42% response rate.
Hold on.
They literally say, we simply have no way of knowing whether sexual assault victims were more or less likely to participate in our study. They specifically say that it is not representative, but that hasn't stopped feminists the world over from misappropriating this dubious study to justify their crybaby demands for safe spaces and special treatment.
Okay, so he goes over the fact that the authors come out and say, like, look, this was a survey, it was distributed on social media, two elements that Sargon has already just previously pointed to as being wrought with bias and wrought with significant methodological errors, and that as a result, to conclude from this survey that in a general rule, 1 in 5 women who have attended a 4-year program at a college campus have been raped, is inappropriate. Okay, and it's feminists who make this claim. Was it feminists who did the goddamn study? Do either of them actually identify as feminists? Not talked about. Maybe it's unknown. Why don't you bring that up? Seed a little doubt. Let people know. I mean, feminists, this is the quality of feminist research that we're seeing. But he doesn't. He does not do that. It's almost a full point. It's almost there. But to say that just merely all feminists repeat it, well, Sargon, you're an anti-feminist, you repeat it. Yes, it's in critique of it, but you repeat it. So how does that tie into the topic at hand?
Gary Gutting is a professor of philosophy at the University of Notre Dame, and he has this to say on how trustworthy data gathered by social science is. Above,
you have one dissenting philosopher. No, I'm not looking for him to name 1,000 dissenting philosophers and waste the entirety of his 10 minutes naming names without actually providing any additional support. But why are we going to this, look at what this one guy says about this one topic?
We need to develop a much better sense of the severely limited reliability of social scientific results. Media reports of research should pay far more attention to these limitations, and scientists reporting the results need to emphasize that they don't show as much as they think they do. Given the limited predictive success and lack of consensus in the social sciences, their conclusions can seldom be primary guides to setting policy. At best, they can supplement the general knowledge, practical experience, good sense, and critical intelligence that we can only hope our politicians will have. Popular feminism, now...
Hey, we're finally talking about feminists, everyone. Let's really put our noses down and open those ears up because we are finally on topic of feminism. Hoo-ah! I'm excited. I hope you are too. So here is yet another little quote that came from Sargon in this debate where he is going over the displeasure of one person on a particular point around social sciences and the data derived from it. He makes a good point in it, though. If you were to look, however, at the entirety of his argument, social sciences and academia is jacked up right now. It's way too left. It has way too much bias in it. So the surveys that they produce, the social sciences they produce, all that data they're producing has inherent reliability and validity problems. And because they have those problems, we need to be extremely skeptical of anything that comes out, to the point where we can only say it's a tiny data point. It gives some context to some very small instance, but in no way can be generalized. Okay, wonderful. Okay, wonderful. Let's see if he can finally tie it in. And all this floating tangent can be bolted down into the center of his argument.
Newly intersectional and all-encompassing, is presented as a comprehensive worldview with a magnitude bordering on the religious. It is based on data that is unreliable and draws conclusions that are deeply biased, and declares them to be an accurate representation of reality to which we must all conform. With foundations this unstable, what kind of person would build a career, let alone a society, on them?
So, all right, look at all this bad data. This is a bad system. And feminists take their data from this bad system, and so feminists are wrong. So, I'll try to rehash Sargon's argument here for him, so it is better than what he was able to present. Feminists study points of interests, but feminists use that said data to tackle crucial topics. When questioned about the importance of said topic, feminists will then point at the data that they have produced. However, no one is doing their due diligence to say that data is bunk, and therefore if you're using bunk data, so will the pursuits following it be bunk also. Sargon lays out very well that academia is wrought with an issue right now around inherent bias. But if we want to tie that into feminism, we need to say more about how is feminism good for the world? Didn't mention that once. So, is feminism good for the world? Well, based upon the data we're seeing produced by feminist scholars and the data which is used by feminist activists to support their claims, I would say that it isn't, because the very data they're using is broken. The social science communities for which they operate in are in fact far too biased and producing way too broken reports for us to actually believe the validity of the claims found within them. And until we can have far more reliable and valid data coming out on the topics which feminists are agitating for, we should not allow ourselves to conclude that feminism is a force for good. That is, in essence, what ought to have been said. In fact, the best point he made in that entire screed of his was when he brought it around and said that the feminist ideology borders on the religious. It is an all-encompassing, all-explaining ideology. How that little wonderful nugget of a quote relates to that 3.5-minute screed about broken social science was not directly linked, but I like it. It's good. But it's also unstable foundations. As unstable as that. Yes, that is also good, but tie in, be far more explicit when you're making these points about how a consistent, internally consistent, logical, flowing, researched argument like bias in social media or social sciences is tied directly to feminism. Without that, you haven't approached the central point of this topic yet. And we have 4 minutes left in his opening statement, for which he could go around and make that. Feminism as an ideology brings us a methodology which is too biased in order to trust the data which comes out. And if feminism wants to correct itself, it's going to have far stronger intellectual rigor in regards to producing sound methodological studies to give us the data to tell us exactly what's going on with the issues feminists agitate for. If we are unable to do that, then we must rely upon other ideologies to correct problems. In fact, one thing that Sargon had an opportunity with those 4 additional minutes was that he ought to have pointed out how Winters' language just prior in her opening statement shows a inborn contempt towards men. Men are always an afterthought in feminism. That is, in essence, a summary of the feminist success in modern society. Men are the afterthought. Every time Winters was bringing up how women have made progress, or feminists had made progress for women, men benefited after the fact. Oh yeah, I guess this helps men. I guess this helps. We changed domestic violence laws, which gave us the Duluth model. But hey, now men can also talk about their violence. Of course, they will get imprisoned and have to do anger management. We'll have to go through the Duluth model in order to ever have access to their home or their children again. But men can now talk about it. Men as the afterthought, the central ideology of feminism. So nowhere in there did Sargon actually respond no to the central question. He didn't even propose a question which links to the topic. Only in a screed of social science misgivings did we get some type of insight that he is unhappy with the state of things. Winters lays out her position as a tradition of success which ought to continue. Why Sargon didn't use his last 4 minutes is beyond me. I wish I knew. Again, I think that comes down to the fact that he had the wrong text file open. But let me say it like this. What did I write here? Because I want to get this said right. Sargon should have taken Winters' points with his remaining time to loosely poke at the issues which exist. How bad data perpetuates senseless and misguided activism, and tie it to the modern feminism that we see, and how it cannot address societal issues. Take the 1 in 5, for example. Here we go. Back on track. Take the 1 in 5 example. He shows that bad social science results in bad data, and how feminists use that bad data as the basis of their activism. Go 2 different directions with that. Show people how that very central point, something that is salient, operates. First, it's an uncritical review of the literature which allows feminists to continue forward. It is either done so by malice or by ignorance. They either know it's false and continue to perpetuate it, or they don't know it's false, but are moved enough to actually agitate on its behalf. Okay? And the second side of it is show how that type of misguided activism brings harm to more people. Look at the number of men that can be falsely accused, or accused under these broken systems of trying to crack down on sexual assault, and how much it destroys the lives of these young men with regularity. Feminist activism, in other words, is moving away from reasoned argument and not just the preponderance of evidence, but beyond a reasonable doubt level of judicial inquiry to preserve the rights and freedoms of individuals. Instead, feminists have aimed to delineate the class of men from women, and have made sure that women who bring accusations against men are ensured some degree of victory. The system now becomes a tool of punishment for bad decisions. This was not talked about by Sargon. He could have easily shown how the best FBI data, and again, this is anticipating your opponent's arguments, would include rape culture, the stats around it, and would have included the wage gap and the stats around it. But back to the rape culture element, how the best data out there shows that women are not being raped at that rate. And in fact, college campuses are one of the safest places on the planet. or in the nation of the United States, for women to be. They have far lower rates of domestic abuse. They have far lower rates of sexual abuse. They are far less likely to be carjacked, robbed, mugged, harmed in any way. Women are far less likely on a college campus to have their security compromised in any way. So why do we continue to hear the 1 in 5 myth? It's because malicious intent feminists continue to push it forward. They want a system which privileges women as either a way to take recompense for the centuries of injustice against women, or to use it to their own advantage. They believe they're owed, that they are due. All in all, it is not a fair portrayal of college campuses to say 1 in 5. This is a feminist argument which is not picked apart by Sargon in a debate asking whether or not feminism is good for the world. It is actually a central point which he ought to have invoked to say, look how it isn't. Look how feminism acts when it has even just a shred of bad data. Look at how feminists are so willing to undermine basic human rights in order to ensure that the data which they believe to be accurate is upheld in a legal or political way. They will find an error and run with it. If we can see it on something as profound and already loathed by society like rape, what other kind of damage are we going to see from feminists? Moving on. We're all just having to sip here.
Thank you very much. That leaves you a good four minutes of time.
That's okay.
Okay.
That's okay. Actually, it's not okay, listeners. It is wrong to leave that much time on the table in a formal debate. You have so little time in these things to cover the vast amount of evidence in your favor. And if you cut yourself short, you are either admitting that you were ill-prepared, or that there is a lack of evidence out there to push the topic further than using only 60% of your allotted time.
Next is the 2 rounds of formal rebuttals, and they will be lasting 5 minutes each. Christy?
All right, I'm just hitting the timer on mine. So I have to say, in terms of rebutting, I'm a little bit confused because I was expecting some sort of frame that
The look on your face tells me you're more than a little bit confused.
answered the question, is feminism good for the world? And no, in a way more directly. And what I've heard is a lot of things sort of complained about, but not a coherent answer as to why feminism isn't a force for good in the world. And I think that I just have to correct some errors. I think one of the first things Carl said was that feminism is a social science. And certainly in the social sciences, we use a feminist perspective. So there are many ways that...
So, very well played by Winters here. She is relying on the unfleshed out argument that Sargon made, trying to connect feminism to broken social science, and takes that point and claims that feminism is not a social science, which is true. Feminism is not a social science. It is an ideology. Yes, it has its own methodologies as a result to tackle the problems for which it perceives, but it is not a social science. It follows under the rubric of social sciences, but it is not in of itself a social science. That's like calling cattle steak machines. Brilliant play by Winters here, by the way. It goes to the very core of Sargon's original opening argument, the limited one that he provided.
When you examine the world, you want to pay attention to the way that it impacts men and women, because there might be similarities and there might be differences. The way to
there might be A, there might be B. If it's not A, then it is B. That's a nothing statement. That's something that should be derided actively in the middle of this, where in a cross-examination you say, oh yes, that's very smart feminism to ensure that if it's not A, then it must be B, and to cover the entirety of all human experiences, and to somehow justify its own existence on such a loose sense. It comes down to the thought that if you have something which explains everything, you, in essence, explain nothing.
evaluate sex differences, the way to evaluate gender norms in a society is through feminist theory.
No. No, it is not, and this is a failure on Sargon coming up here. But as the active participant here who has control of the pause button, I can stop time and say, no, feminism is not the only way to look at gender norms, to look at gender differences, and to come to some type of conclusion about them. What the hell are evolutionary biologists looking at if we aren't considering them looking at the differences between genders? What about these evolutionary psychologists who are actively looking at the differences between men and women to determine some type of predictable model of behavior in a general sense? That is an absurd statement, but it's one you could anticipate being made by a feminist. A Christian will always say that the universe is explainable under Christianity. An atheist will say it is not, and in fact we have a dozen ways to explain how things work, from how we can look at how we came to be in evolution to how we reason with one another in evolutionary biology, to how do we deal with moral issues with philosophy. There's egalitarianism that we could deal with. There's nihilism to explain how we should move forward in this world. There's an near endless number of philosophies that we can use to explain why there's differences between men and women, and feminism is not the only one.
And so it is really, feminist theory is the way to problematize or examine sex differences, gender norms in a society.
Feminism, or feminist theory, is a way to problematize sex differences. This, a statement made by a feminist, turns out to be one of the best, strongest anti-feminist statements you will come across. Feminist theory is a way to problematize sex differences. Yes, Miss Winters, it is. And the fact that that thing screamed and echoed in my ears while I was listening to this the first time around, and it continues to sit there because it explains exactly why Sargon failed in the debate to land crushing blows. Taking that statement there, that verbatim quote by Ms. Winters, and tie it into broken social science would have cut her down at the knees. She would have been stopped dead at that point by saying that, yes, social science, as a broken methodology, has given feminists the tool to problematize sex differences. Rather than differences just existing and having unique value, they are taken immediately as a problem, as an issue, as something that requires correction. If we can't correct it in a legal sense, then we have to correct it in some other way. We have to use our philosophies to then change how we view this. We've got to change the language around it. We've got to change how we interpret it. We've got to suppress dissent, and we have to modify how we speak about it to ensure that the difference, if unexplainable in feminism, can be brushed off, erased, removed.
And that's why it's used in economics, in political science, in communications, and anthropology.
Isn't that great, feminism? You have feminist economics and feminist geology and feminist anthropology and feminist math and feminist chemistry, because it makes sense that the female interpretation of the world, or a feminist interpretation of the world, is actually too different from the rest of reality, and it requires a specific non-logic based model to do so. Wonderful. Tell me, how are we going to continue to get stunning research about feminist glaciology and how the masculine glaciology is inherently sexist and will not properly address the issues facing the world with the ending of glaciers, and how we should actually look at glaciers rather than reservoirs of water that determine the sea level, but instead as art and beauty? Are we going to get more research like that? Or how carbon steel is in fact inherently sexist because it plays off of male power fantasies? Is that what we're going to get from feminist engineering? These are real studies. They actually exist. They were written by real human beings and received federal money to do so. either to pay for their education or to produce the research. What's remarkable is that is what we see when we start allowing feminism to have its own interpretation of economic models, of anthropological models, of geological models, and so forth.
Because it is the framework. Just as if you wanted to examine class divisions between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, you would have to go back to Marx, because he came up with the idea and everyone who followed on from him used those ideas.
So because Marx identified the classes, which he didn't, you have to use Marxism. You must use Marxism as the way to determine class differences. You must. That is the only ideology which you're allowed to use. You cannot use capitalism as a method to determine certain individuals with different levels of socioeconomic status, which will determine their engageability with the current market for either necessities or with extravagancies. No, you have to look at Marx as the only possible way. This is a wonderful justification made by Winters here to ensure that when she says feminism is the way I have to look at the world, is not just a choice from her, but that she can make freely, but it's the choice because it is the only possible way to view the world to ensure sexual equality for humans. It is deeply myopic, and in fact is almost to the point of willful deception. But then again, this is what one who believes they have found the one true religion must engage in with regularity to ensure that any niggling doubts that come up in their head can be removed. Look at his face. Look at that face of Sargon right there. He is fucking laughing at it. He is, are you fucking kidding me? He's thinking, what a joke. Which, if this is, by the way, debaters, listeners, if you're listening to something like this debate, and you come across a point that makes you go, what the fuck, or laugh out loud like Sargon is doing, you need to take that, turn it into a cudgel, and beat your opponent endlessly with it until they yield. This is the easiest point Sargon can be making in his upcoming cross-examination. We'll see what he does.
It's the same thing with feminist theory. It was feminists who started to point out and draw attention to the differences between men and women in society.
Did feminism properly exist in the mid-1600s? So when we had female authors writing about sex differences in their novels, does that make them feminists? Would one consider Jane Austen a feminist? She pointed out plenty of differences in the actions of males and females. Obvious differences. How women go about to bring men in, and how men go about to try and woo women. Yes, it's a cursory example, but it's one that I think begins to erode, which is the intent of bringing up these points, the argument made by your opponent. Nowhere can she possibly establish that feminism existed well before, in essence, the 1890s, where the suffragette movement was originally taking place. Now, why you want to bring this up is simply that you want to be able to justify why your particular worldview is the right worldview and how you can use it in its all-encompassing manner.
So just because something is feminist doesn't necessarily make it not credible, because it's a lens through which to analyze social phenomenon.
It's a lens. It's a lens. The problem is you don't wear your sunglasses indoors, right? You don't wear your sunglasses at night. You don't wear your sunglasses when it's pretty dark and overcast and heavy rain. There's a time for it, in other words, in a limited time. You want to have this lens on only when it's appropriate, but then take it off and analyze the surroundings without the lens. One must do this to ensure that the data for which they are collecting with the lens on is reliable, because you have to weigh it against other counterpoints. Feminists, however, within these social science rubrics, often engage in, the best way to put it is, pursuit of anything but the null variable. They look at, okay, I want to show that there is a relationship between, for example, fraternities and the numbers of sexual assaults that take place on a campus, and we're going to look at the model saying that, the more fraternities you have, the more sexual assaults you're going to have. That's our effectively our research question. One, when doing research, should be doing the null variable, saying that, number of independent variables will not affect the dependent variable. The number of fraternities will not actually affect the number of rates of sexual assault on campus. If you then do your research and you find a significant difference between colleges with lots of fraternities versus colleges with no or few fraternities, then you have a legitimate point to make. But if you do it the other way around, what you end up doing is adjusting where that cutoff point is. What determines lots of fraternities and no or few fraternities? Who knows? What you'd likely end up seeing is, if you do something on the null variable, is colleges with no fraternities as one group, and the other group is one or more fraternities. Well, how easy is that delineation going to be?
Also do it through racial justice. You can do
Because here, I want to finish that point there, because if you have a fraternity, that means you have men on campus. If you have men on campus, that means you have the presupposed perpetrator of sexual assault. If you have no fraternities, you are either a tiny little online school, or you are an all-girls school. And if there's no men going to that campus, then yes, you're not going to have very many sexual assaults perpetuated by men. So it's an easy low-hanging fruit.
it through rational choice theory. You can do it through other forms of theoretical frameworks that are available in the social sciences.
You're right. There are other forms of or theories that we can use to analyze differences between men and women, including evolutionary psychology. Yet feminists seem to malign evolutionary psychology with great rigor. It's remarkable how many feminists hate evolutionary biology.
I also want to pick up on Carl's note of the social network data. And social network data is different from survey data. Social network data and social media data
I will point out Christy Winters is a garbage statistician. She really is.
are relatively new phenomena, and they are highly skewed not because the data are bad inherently or because the researchers are unreliable, but simply because people who use it are not representative of a full...
That means the data is inherently bad, you fucking tool. If the research methods which are used are unreliable, that means the data is inherently bad. If you lack reliability, you have no validity. Period. Period. When you're doing research, reliability is central. If you have reliability, you can move ahead. If you have no reliability, it doesn't matter at all what the conclusion is. It doesn't matter how valid it appears. It is inherently broken and must be discarded. Period. And if you have a system which is producing research which is always unreliable because the peer review process is so biased and so cloistered around one political ideology, you're going to continue to produce unreliable research from this place. And that means none of the results are valid and none of it can be considered to be used in any type of context, period. Zero. I mean, the only thing it can be used for, literally, is an example of bad research that should always be discarded. That's it. You can't even make jokes about it. It's so fucking terrible. And this woman is a fucking imbecile when it comes to statistics. Ooh, okay. Statistics. There we go.
range of population.
Getting a little too hot here. Can't even say a word.
And we're seeing with deeper penetration, with more people getting access to places like Twitter and the internet, with internet access reaching out into more and more rural areas, we're seeing more people join on to social media. But to paint social network analysis is...
And where's your data for that? Where's your research? That's an argument from ignorance. Dismissed!
Being the same as survey data, I think, is disingenuous and just wrong. I mean, survey methodology has been practiced long before social media even existed. You know, the famous attempts at telephone survey.
No fucking way. Listeners, this is wonderful, because this is a tangent, and you can dismiss everything she is saying here. It has no bearing on a proper cross-examination of Sargon's points, because she doesn't relate it to how that actually undermines Sargon saying that, you know, feminists are using this broken data because it's coming from inherently biased sources. She's saying, well, social media survey data is, yeah, I mean, it's not great, but it's not inherently bad.
To predict American elections when they realized that people who had telephones had more money and therefore were more likely to vote for the Republican candidate, which skewed the results. So using statistical probabilities and sampling, there's entire industries that are set up public opinion polling, marketing requires accurate data. And for the markets to work, they have to understand their customers. And they use sampling frames to get representative samples in order to generalize to the population because they want to target the right people with the right data.
There's a big difference, however, when someone's beginning to talk about marketing, and please go read Gad Saad's book about the consumptive instinct. Marketing isn't inherently biased, not like the way these social sciences are, which was a well laid out argument by Sargon. Marketing relies upon quantitative, not qualitative, but quantitative, that is, measurable, numerically measurable outcomes, whereas feminism usually relies on qualitative, reported changes in opinion. If you have a marketing campaign, you can determine if it's successful because people will either be purchasing your goods or services with greater regularity than prior to the marketing campaign. You have no equivalent using social science data under the feminist rubric and marketing data. So she's just going off here on a topic that she knows just the most fucking cursory level about in order to write garbage papers.
If all social science data was unreliable, we wouldn't have good marketing. We
would have fantastic marketing still, because there's other ways for which you can determine how to target a population through marketing. 1. 2, you can still have fantastically reliable sources because you can have other forms of research that are reliable, that do not rely solely on these quote-unquote social science style datas. The problem that Sargon's laying out here is not that social science is inherently broken. It's because social science is populated by such a politically homogeneous group right now that the peer review process doesn't allow for the weeding out of bad ideas, and that they do not identify within the peer review process unreliability. Okay, sorry, I'm more or less arguing against Christy Winters right now, and I'm sorry for that, but I want to really show how these little language tricks which can be used by another debater can be cut at, how you can chop at them, bring them down. It's disingenuous what she is doing right now.
Be able to, have companies do successful marketing campaigns. And so I think, while I have still a minute and a half left, what perhaps is most disappointing is that Carl's obsession with the ivory tower. My concerns about feminism in the world, it deals with activism. It deals with things like identifying, creating spaces for victims to talk about their victimization now that the FBI has changed its definition. Dealing with the fact
men is an afterthought. Feminism at its best results in men as an afterthought.
That laws no longer protect.
Which, by the way, is a wonderful argument made right against the grain of her core principles here. Men as an afterthought, it comes up endlessly with this woman and with feminists in general. Men are an afterthought. We are here to help women and women alone, and that once we have enough pressure on us, yes, we'll consider men. But guess what? There's a better ideology out there. There's one that'll consider both sides equally.
People, because we've talked about rape as a form of consent rather than being just about a man penetrating a woman, vaginally. That there are important campaigns going on about honor killings, which is a problem in the UK. Girls in the UK are being killed in honor killings, and that's an issue that needs to be talked about. Female genital mutilation happens culturally, not just in developing countries, but around the world. There are child bride issues. And there's a lot of issues that I think these are interesting discussions to have.
Yeah, and that's about the best as you're going to do about that there, Ms. Winters. Honor killings in the United Kingdom. If feminism is really good for the world, how is feminism tackling the issue of honor killings in the United Kingdom? You're saying that they are. You're not providing a single note on here. You haven't actually mentioned one source so far in your rebut. So how is feminism tackling the problem of honor killings in the United Kingdom? Because I know secularism is. They're saying that the cultural practices which are born out of Islamic tradition are actually barbaric and should be completely outlawed. And in fact, individuals who practice it deserved significant jail time. And not only do the individuals who commit the act itself, it's those who are complicit in the perpetuation of the act that are also guilty in this. They act as accessories and do deserve prison time also. That's what secular activists are saying. What are feminists saying? If feminism is the all-encompassing, one true answer to resolving social ills, especially those of which that affect women, why are you unable to tell us anything, one single coherent line of reasoning about how the functioning of feminist activism is addressing these issues which you continually prat on about? There is nothing.
But when it comes to improving the lives of men and women, I think the answer really does, I think I'm making a better case here for activism in the world, not just looking.
You're not in the least bit creating that case. At this point, take note. She said, I'm creating the argument for more activism in the world. Might be true in the sense that, in fact, there is a reason that we should engage in this activism, because we're seeing a degree of bad behavior coming from people that's very worthwhile in our efforts to call out and to change and to curb. But nowhere in there is it saying actually that feminism is the one that should be doing it.
At the ivory tower and how people talk about it in published journals. And with that, I'll yield the remainder of my 40 seconds back to the moderators.
All right.
All right, indeed. Now, we are about 10 minutes shy of the 2-hour mark of this video, and I want to just conclude this here. I will call this part 1. I have lots of notes here, lots of notes because of this, and I combed through this very slowly. The ivory tower, as she jokes about in this case, is the center for which the broken ideology of feminism is operating in. It is the place which is producing the broken data, which then is perpetuated by other feminists in media circles to ensure that their ideology remains the one true one to address the larger issues faced by women. If the ivory tower was producing sound, reliable research that says, actually, hey, women get raped, yes, but it's 5.6 per every 100,000. It's not nearly as terrible as it's made out to be. It's not 20%. Okay, we're not talking about 40,000 out of 100,000, or sorry, 20,000 out of 100,000 women. We are talking about 5.6. That is endless magnitudes of difference. It is really, really unfortunate how terrible Ms. Winters has done in her rebut here, because she, one, showed that she has very little understanding of social science, research methodology. 2, has failed to establish that feminism as an activist movement is the one that will solve issues that she continuously lists time and again: female genital mutilation, honor killings, acid attacks, and so forth. Not once does she establish in a clear, obvious way. Sargon, on the other hand, has a very internally consistent, strong argument about the academic situation on campuses, but he doesn't tie it too tightly to feminists and their production of poor research, which is then perpetuated outside of academia. At this point, which I also know what comes next, but I am leaving it open for individuals who just kind of want to listen to the review as it goes, as a fight review, I want really, really to emphasize the failure of logic taking place by both sides. I'm going to conclude here with a brief screed of my own. I will welcome from the description link to a conclusion. This is part 1. I will do part 2 in about a day or so. But here is the kind of breakdown conclusion thus far. Is feminism good for the world? No. It is not. First and second wave feminism have produced fantastic results. Third wave feminism, on the other hand, is looking at increasingly granular issues, which are to the point where they are only microscopically evaluated. That's why we call them microaggressions, after all. They are too tiny to delineate from the actual issues faced by people. Feminism as the ideology, however, claims to be the one way to resolve these issues, when it truly is not. There is, in fact, a countless number of other methodologies or ideologies which can address the severity of some political issues as they exist today. Egalitarianism, for example, is one that will look at the experiences of both men and women simultaneously, rather than feminism or feminist theory, the way to problematize sex differences, looking at how these sex differences affect women and then deal with men as an afterthought. And in fact, with the abundance of other optional theories out there to select to approach these issues, we have to ask ourselves about the validity, the reach of modern feminism. If in fact modern feminism as a tool can be used to correct issues in places like the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia, as we talk about how women are harmed in those countries, then we have to see about its likelihood to produce success. Well, if women are so derided in those countries, then we must have to select an opportunity whereby another ideology could bring around a wide enough social change. And in fact, the areas where feminists have had success have always been in liberal democracies, places where the individual is valued, where there is a cultural tradition of fighting inequality and working towards justice. Sure, not every member of a community always works with the same vigor towards that goal, but as a general sense, I could say that most people within the American society want to make a place, the United States, a more fair and just country. That's why feminism is allowed to continue to operate. We allow freedom of speech and the opportunity to say what you have on your mind. But what we should not allow for is intellectually dishonest practices to continue. Feminism being a vendor, a merchant of illogical and non sequitur arguments, is one that needs to be honestly reviewed in debates such as this one. And when we ask, is feminism good for the world? We must say no. No, it is not, because as a tool, its time is spent in the West, and in the East or in other countries where women really do need help, we must rely on secular egalitarianism and humanism to address the issues faced by women. If we rely solely on feminism to do so, we will become increasingly more myopic, focusing more and more on the personal inconveniences of Western women while ignoring the pain suffered by women in places like Iraq and Iran, Qatar, Syria, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, the Philippines, and so forth. There is enough countries out there that we should really be concerned about how feminism and the energy that put forth by these individuals can be used for good. And I'm sorry to say, for those feminists out there, no. Your ideology is not all-encompassing. It does not explain all, and nor will it explain all. We must rely on this realization coming to feminists so that they may change their gears towards a movement, of political movement, an ideological movement that will help men and women equally in the pursuit of increasing rights and protections for all. Thank you all very much for watching part 1 of this. I will continue part 2 in the days to come.